Why does everyone around you keep treating you like you're still 17, even though you're paying your own rent now, holding down a job, technically running your own life on paper? Why does your girlfriend sigh the exact same way your mother used to, right before she says, "I'll just do it myself," and walks off to handle whatever it was you were supposed to handle? You tell yourself it's because they're controlling or impatient or expecting too much from you, asking for things nobody should reasonably have to ask for twice. But what if the problem isn't them? What if there's a very specific psychological pattern running underneath your behavior? One that was installed in you years before you ever called yourself an adult, quietly, without your permission, and it's been steering your relationships ever since, long after you stopped noticing it was even there. There's a term for this, and you've probably heard it thrown at you before, maybe as a joke at a party, maybe as something a lot sharper, said in the middle of an argument with real frustration behind it. It's called man-child syndrome. Strip away the meme version of it, the lazy internet jokes about video games and instant noodles, and here's what it actually means underneath all that. It's a pattern where a grown man, physically an adult, financially functioning to some degree, holding a job, maybe even owning property, still operates emotionally like a teenager who never had to grow up internally, no matter how much growing up happened on the outside. Someone else manages the consequences. Someone else absorbs the emotional labor. Someone else remembers the bills, plans the future, books the appointments, and quietly cleans up the mess again and again without ever being asked to volunteer for the role. And you, the man at the center of all this, mostly just enjoy your life while quietly assuming, somewhere in the back of your mind, that someone else has it handled, because so far they always have. And here's the part that might sting a little more than you'd like it to. You might be living this right now, today, in your current relationship, without ever having named it. Not because you're lazy in some moral sense, not because you're a bad person who doesn't care, but because somewhere along the way, years ago, you learned, deeply and without ever questioning it, that being responsible for yourself was optional as long as someone else was willing to pick up the slack you left behind. And someone always has been, which is exactly why you never had a reason to stop. In this video, you're going to look at 5 signs that reveal whether this pattern lives in you. Each one connects to a real psychological mechanism, not just a personality flaw, but an actual reason your brain defaults to this behavior. Some of these you'll recognize instantly. Others are quieter, sneakier, the kind of thing you've never once stopped to question because it's just how you are. Stay until the end because the last sign is the one most men miss entirely, and it's usually the one doing the most damage. Let's start with the one that's probably the easiest to spot, even if you've never named it out loud. Sign 1, you outsource your emotional regulation to someone else. Here's what this looks like in practice. You have a bad day, and instead of sitting with that discomfort, you immediately need someone to fix your mood. A phone call, a text, reassurance, attention. You don't necessarily ask for it directly, but you make your bad mood very, very visible, sighing a little louder than necessary, going quiet in a way that's impossible to miss, dropping hints about how rough your day was without actually explaining what happened. And then you wait for someone to notice and respond, almost like you're running a test to see who in your life is paying close enough attention to rescue you from a feeling you could have handled on your own. Psychologically, this traces back to something called affect regulation, which is a skill that's supposed to develop in childhood through what's called co-regulation, where a caregiver's calm nervous system helps soothe your distressed one over and over until your brain gradually builds its own internal version of that soothing mechanism and no longer needs to borrow it from someone else. As a kid, a parent helps soothe your nervous system until eventually you internalize the ability to soothe yourself, the same way training wheels are supposed to come off a bike once balance has actually been learned.
But if that process gets interrupted, if a parent overfunctioned for you emotionally, doing all the soothing and never handing the skill back, stepping in to manage every tantrum, every disappointment, every hard feeling before you ever got the chance to sit inside it yourself. You grow into an adult who never built that internal muscle because it was never required of you. So you keep looking for an external regulator, someone whose presence alone can talk your nervous system down. First it was mom, now it's your girlfriend, your wife, sometimes even your friends. And on a bad enough day, honestly, sometimes just a stranger on the internet who happens to say the right thing at the right moment. Picture this. You had a rough meeting at work, the kind where your manager said something dismissive in front of the whole team, and it stung more than you wanted to admit. Instead of processing it, going for a walk, journaling, calling a friend just to vent it out, or simply letting the irritation pass through you the way feelings are actually designed to do if you let them, you come home and you're short with your partner. Not because she did anything, but because some part of you needs her to ask what's wrong, to comfort you, to take the emotional weight off your shoulders that you never learned how to carry yourself. And if she's tired too, if she's had her own rough day and doesn't immediately clock that something is off with you, you don't say anything directly. You just get colder, more withdrawn, answering in shorter sentences, almost punishing her for not reading your mind, even though you never gave her a single clue to read. That's not romance, and it's definitely not mystery. That's outsourced regulation, and it's exhausting for the person on the receiving end, who eventually starts to feel less like a partner and more like an unpaid, unappreciated emotional support technician. This sign sets the stage for the next one, because emotional outsourcing rarely happens alone. It almost always comes paired with a second habit, one that's about who handles the actual logistics of your life. Sign 2. You treat basic adult responsibilities as optional side quests. This is the one people joke about the most, but it's worth taking seriously because underneath the joke is a genuinely costly pattern. Paying bills on time, scheduling your own doctor's appointments instead of needing a reminder text 3 separate times, doing laundry before you're literally out of clean clothes and forced to dig through the hamper for the least dirty option, buying groceries before the fridge is completely empty except for a lone condiment and some questionable leftovers. These aren't difficult tasks. None of them require any special skill or intelligence. They just require follow-through. But if you consistently forget, consistently need reminders, consistently let someone else step in and just handle it because you didn't, that's not forgetfulness, no matter how many times you call it that. That's learned helplessness. And it's been quietly reinforced every single time someone bailed you out, instead of letting you feel the natural consequence of your own inaction. In psychology, learned helplessness develops when a behavior repeatedly gets the same outcome regardless of effort, until you eventually stop trying altogether, because some part of your brain has quietly concluded that effort simply doesn't change the result. But there's a domestic version of this that's less about failure and punishment and more about reward, which honestly makes it even harder to break. If every single time you forget something, someone else steps in and fixes it without consequence, without a single argument, without ever making you sit in the discomfort of an unpaid bill or an unwashed shirt, your brain learns a very efficient lesson, the same kind of lesson any reward-based system teaches. Why build the skill? Why spend the effort when avoidance gets the exact same result, minus all the work? Think about the classic scene, the one practically every long-term partner of a man-child has lived through at least once. Dishes pile up in the sink for 3 days, maybe longer. You walk past them every single day, multiple times a day actually, on your way to the fridge, on your way to the couch. You're fully capable of washing a plate. It takes maybe 4 minutes. You're not physically incapable of this. But you don't because some part of you knows that eventually your partner, your roommate, your mother on a surprise visit, someone is going to get fed up enough and just do it themselves rather than keep asking. You're not consciously testing them on purpose. It's rarely that calculated. But you've built an entire operating system around the quiet expectation that someone else's frustration threshold is lower than your own laziness threshold. And so far, in your experience, you've bet correctly every single time, which is exactly why the behavior never had a reason to change.
Now here's where it gets more interesting, because this pattern doesn't just show up with chores. It shows up in something far more personal, something that touches the actual core of how you see your relationships. Sign 3. You confuse being taken care of with being loved. This one is subtle, and it's probably the one you've never consciously articulated, even to yourself, mostly because it doesn't feel like a belief. It feels like just how love naturally works. Somewhere in your emotional wiring, care has quietly become the actual metric for love itself. If someone cooks for you, reminds you of things you'd otherwise forget, manages your schedule, soothes your moods without being asked, you interpret all of that as love, real and undeniable. But if someone expects you to reciprocate that same level of care, to actually show up for them the way they consistently show up for you, it doesn't register as love anymore, strangely enough. It starts to feel like pressure instead, like a demand, like something being taken from you instead of something you're meant to willingly give back. This usually comes from childhood dynamics where care flowed almost entirely in one direction, from parent to child, with very little expectation of anything flowing back the other way. A parent who did everything, who asked for very little in return, who never sat you down and said, "Now it's your turn to take care of me," made love feel synonymous with being served, quietly and consistently, without ever having to earn it or return it. So as an adult, when a partner asks for the same energy back, when she wants you to remember her birthday without being reminded, to notice when she's struggling without her having to spell it out, to actually initiate effort instead of just receiving it, it feels foreign to you, genuinely unfamiliar, almost unfair, even though logically you know it isn't. Like the relationship has suddenly become work, when really it just became mutual, which is what a relationship was always supposed to be in the first place. Here's the scene that plays out in almost every relationship like this, often more than once. Your partner gets sick, maybe a bad flu, and she still cooks for you, still manages the house, still keeps everything functioning more or less on schedule, because she's used to being the one who holds things together no matter what state her own body is in. But when you get sick, even with something mild, the entire household seems to stop and reorganize itself around your recovery. You expect soup, sympathy, total silence so you can rest undisturbed, maybe even a little babying, someone checking your temperature, fluffing your pillow, asking if you need anything every 20 minutes. And when she doesn't drop everything for you the exact same way you'd unconsciously expect her to, when she's too tired or too busy from holding up her own end of the household, you feel neglected, maybe even quietly resentful, without ever once stopping to ask yourself honestly whether you've ever shown up for her with that same level of devotion when the roles were reversed. That confusion between care and love sets up the next sign perfectly, because if you've never learned to give care, you've also never learned how to handle being told that your behavior has consequences. Sign 4. You react to accountability like it's an attack. This is the sign that usually causes the most damage in relationships, more than any of the others on this list, because it's the one that ceramic escalates conflict instead of resolving it, turning small fixable issues into recurring fights about nothing and everything at once. When someone calls out a pattern, even gently, even lovingly, with all the tact in the world, your first instinct isn't reflection. It isn't curiosity about whether they might have a point. It's defense, immediate and automatic. You get irritated before you've even fully processed what was said. You feel accused, even when the comment was barely a complaint. Sometimes you flip the conversation entirely, turning her concern into her being too sensitive or too controlling, when really she just asked you calmly to take the trash out more than once a week. This connects to something called fragile self-esteem, where your sense of self-worth is so unstable underneath the surface that any criticism, even constructive, even necessary, even delivered with love, feels like a referendum on your entire character rather than a comment on one single behavior. It doesn't feel like feedback, it feels like an attack on who you fundamentally are as a person. Healthy accountability sounds like, I did that wrong, let me fix it. Fragile accountability sounds like, why are you always attacking me? Which conveniently shuts the conversation down before any actual change ever has to happen. Picture the argument. She brings up, calmly and without raising her voice, that you've canceled plans with her 3 times this month, which by any reasonable measure is a completely fair observation worth discussing. Instead of acknowledging it, instead of even pausing for a second to consider whether it's true, you go straight to, so now I can't even have a bad week without you keeping score? And just like that, the entire direction of the conversation flips. Suddenly, she's the villain for noticing a pattern that genuinely affects her, and you never actually have to address the pattern itself, because now the conversation is about her tone, her timing, her attitude, anything except the 3 canceled plans.
This isn't an isolated moment, and it rarely is. It's a defense mechanism running on autopilot, protecting you from ever having to sit, even briefly, in the deeply uncomfortable feeling of simply being wrong. And that brings you to the final sign, the one that ties every single pattern before it together, the one most men never even consider because it doesn't look like a flaw from the inside. It looks like personality. Sign 5. You mistake comfort for identity. This is the quietest sign on the entire list, and arguably the most dangerous one, precisely because it doesn't look dramatic at all from the outside, or even from the inside. It looks like simply being who you are, your actual personality, not a flaw, not a pattern, just you. You've built an identity around being the fun one, the laid-back one, the one who doesn't stress about anything, and people probably even compliment you for it regularly. And on the surface, that sounds genuinely great. Who wouldn't want to be the easygoing guy at every gathering? But underneath it, there's often an unspoken agreement that nobody ever actually said out loud. Someone else gets to be the responsible one, the planner, the worrier, the one who holds the structure together, so that you get to keep being the fun one, indefinitely, without ever having to trade roles. Psychologically, this is a form of role rigidity within relationships. Roles get assigned early, sometimes explicitly, sometimes just through repeated behavior, and once they're locked in, breaking out of them feels like losing a piece of yourself. If you've spent 10 years being the easygoing guy, actually stepping up, planning the trip, initiating the hard conversation, handling the finances, can feel less like growth and more like betrayal of your own identity. So you protect the role, even when the role is quietly costing you your relationships. Here's the moment this usually surfaces, and it tends to come out of nowhere, at least from your side of things. Your partner says, exhausted, maybe even close to tears, that she's tired of always being the one who plans everything, manages everything, holds everything together while you coast along beside her. And your honest, immediate gut reaction isn't guilt, and it isn't motivation to step up. It's confusion, genuine confusion. Because in your mind, you've never been the planner. You've never been the responsible one. That's just not you. That's not who you've ever been. As if personality were some fixed trait handed to you at birth, rather than a set of habits you've simply never tried to change. You're not seeing a flaw to fix in that moment. You're seeing an identity under threat. And that, more than any single bad habit on this entire list, is what keeps men stuck in this pattern for years, sometimes for entire relationships, sometimes, if nothing ever interrupts it, for life. Now that you've heard all 5 of these, take a moment, an honest one, not a defensive one, the kind where you're not already preparing your counterargument before the thought even finishes, and think about which of these actually applies to you, specifically, in your own relationships, not in some abstract, general sense. Maybe it's just one. Maybe, if you're being genuinely real with yourself instead of giving yourself the easy pass, it's 3 or 4, or honestly, all 5. The point of this isn't to make you feel attacked, and it's definitely not to make you feel ashamed for existing this way, since none of this was entirely your fault to begin with. It's to make you notice the pattern before someone else gets tired enough of pointing it out for you and decides, quietly, that they're done waiting for you to notice on your own. If any part of this hit a little too close to home, send it to someone, maybe even yourself, in a private note you'll actually reread later, and sit with it for a minute instead of scrolling past and forgetting it by tomorrow. There's one more thing worth understanding here, though, because knowing the signs is only half the equation. The real question is where this pattern actually started, and that takes you somewhere most people never expect to look. If you want to understand exactly how this gets built in the first place, you'll want to watch the video linked right here on how overprotective or overly accommodating parenting quietly creates emotionally underdeveloped adults, even when the parents' intentions were completely loving. It connects directly to everything you just learned, and it might explain a lot more about your own story than this video alone ever could. Thank you for watching this one all the way through. It genuinely means something that you stuck around for a topic that isn't always easy to sit with, especially when some of it probably felt a little too familiar. If this gave you something to think about, drop a like. It actually helps this channel reach more people who need to hear it but haven't found it yet. And in the comments, be honest, no need to perform for anyone. Which of these 5 signs hit closest to home for you? Subscribe if you want more videos like this, the kind that don't just entertain you, but actually help you understand yourself a little bit better, one uncomfortable truth at a time. And if you tap that notification bell, you won't miss the next one. See you in the next video.